In the previous video, we saw how, according to Yogacara, the everyday reality most of us experience is mostly a projection from our own past habits and mind delusions. The world we inhabit is quite close to the matrix in some ways, and the result of believing in that delusion is that we suffer because we're constantly asking life for something that it can't deliver. But what would it even mean to wake up from that delusion according to this view? And what is our mind doing all the time that keeps us trapped? Why is it so hard to let go of our confusion? Are we just hopelessly trapped? Or is there a way to learn how to liberate ourselves? In the second part of the series on Buddhism and the Matrix, I'm going to answer all these questions according to the Buddhist view, drawing mainly from the Yogacara school with examples from the Matrix movie. But there's also a surprise. I'm going to talk about one very big difference between Buddhism and the Matrix, and why I think the former is a much more hopeful view about reality and human nature. I really hope you will get something useful out of this video and that you will enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Let me know what you thought in the comments. This video was produced by Dharma Realm Buddhist University. At DRBU, we study the great books of East and West as living traditions that can be embodied and practiced in our everyday lives. We live and study in a small, non-hierarchical community guided by Buddhist principles, and our work-study program allows students to graduate debt-free while working with and for the community. For more information, take a look at our website, drbu.edu. Before we start, I would like to ask you to do something with me. A little thought experiment, if you will, which will hopefully help make what follows less abstract and more relevant for daily life. So please close your eyes and take a moment to just land where you are. Slow down. Take a deep breath. Notice how your body feels. If you notice any tension, try to relax a bit. Feel free to pause the video at any point if you need a bit more time. Now, I want you to think about your week. What's been going on for you? The important stuff and the trivial stuff. Whatever comes to mind. How have your days been like? Take a moment to remember what's been happening to you, what you've been doing, how you've been feeling, and what you've been thinking. Chances are, during this week, you had good moments and bad moments, calm moments and stressful moments, worried moments and relaxed moments. However, can you notice the sense of me that runs through your entire experience? For me, it feels almost like a subtle layer of stress that underlies every moment, as I try to make sure that I'm okay, that I'll be able to get what I want and avoid what I don't want. If something threatens this security and control, it can be really stressful and destabilizing. So just reflect on that for a second. How does it feel to be you? Now, here's where it gets interesting. Bear with me for a bit more. Just as a thought experiment, try to imagine that you suddenly knew that your life is a dream and you're going to wake up eventually. Take a moment to really try to imagine what that would be like. Living your life exactly as it is, but knowing that it's just a dream. See if you can conjure up that feeling, even a little bit. For me, as soon as I imagine that, there's a deep feeling of relaxation that comes, a kind of letting go of the things that seemed so serious and all important, almost like putting down a heavy burden. What was your experience like? Let me know in the comments. If you still have your eyes closed, you can open them now. I hope that by doing this, we can also get a small sense of how in everyday life we can fret and stress so much about things to the point that we can lose sight of the things that truly matter and we stop enjoying life and just being. That's just life for most of us. Everything seems so real, doesn't it? Our life, the things that happen to us, we tend to take everything really seriously. Well, it is serious, it's our life. But what about the people in the Matrix? Everything feels really real for them too, doesn't it? It's also their life, their problems, their struggles. What if Morpheus told you that you are really living in a simulation? Would that change the way you're living your life? What I think is very interesting about the Matrix is that it's through this revelation that Neo gains his superpowers and transcends mundane existence. He isn't free because he has special powers. He has special powers because he is free from the illusion of the Matrix, because he really knows. It's this knowledge that sets him free, having truly internalized that everything around him is not what he thought it was. In a way, this is similar to the Buddhist idea of enlightenment. In Buddhism, true freedom comes from this ability to see things for what they are and not be deluded by our mind's projections, by the matrix, if you will. And this is supposed to be a profoundly liberating experience. In the words of Ajahn Sumedho, a senior monk in the Thai forest tradition,
Nirvana is like when you've been carrying this heavy burden on your back for a lifetime and you're really exhausted. You're so tired of this weight, carrying this heavy weight around, that you put it down. And that's Nibbana.
as we saw in the previous video, Buddhist thinkers have taken a lot of effort to describe exactly how it is that the mind functions and constructs the world we inhabit. In a way, you could say that they have provided us with a very detailed description of how the matrix we are in works and how it is actually built moment by moment. We also said that the surface level of this delusion comes from the narratives that we are constantly projecting on the world and which color the way we look at everything. What we like, what we don't like, the opinions we have, and our worldview in general. However, we also said that our mental trapping goes very, very deep into ever more subtle layers. At the deepest level, the Yogacharyans concluded that the fundamental ignorance, avidya, the thing that conditions all the rest, lies at the basic distinction of subject and object that our mind is making all the time, at the most subtle, most basic level of its functioning. Let's unpack this. Descartes already told us that at the most basic level, consciousness is a subject being aware of an object. I think. You just can't get any more basic than that, right? Everything, absolutely everything you can think, imagine, experience, feel, taste, see, smell, or hear will always, at its core, be a consciousness experiencing an object. Every single moment of our lives is me coming into contact with stuff. This was really understood by phenomenological philosophers in the middle of the 20th century, who called this the intentionality of consciousness. The basic fact that consciousness is always consciousness of something. You can't really ever experience consciousness without an object. Or in the words of phenomenological philosopher Franz Brentano, every psychic phenomenon is characterized by the intentional inexistence of an object. Every psychic phenomenon contains something as an object within itself, though not every one in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something acknowledged or rejected. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. So, in every mental act, at the most basic level, there is always a subject apprehending an object. And from there, the entire universe happens. At least the universe as is given for us to experience. However, there is a major point of departure here. Whereas for the Cartesian tradition, this I, who is undeniably always there in some kind of way, experiencing an object, was used as solid evidence for knowing that I exist, as a thing that is thinking. For Yogacara, there is already the seed of delusion in this very distinction. The very fact that we distinguish between subject and object, that we create this duality, is itself a delusion. This is explained in a passage of the Shurangama Sutra, which I personally find kind of mind-blowing in terms of how could someone describe the workings of the mind at such a subtle level. I'm just going to give you the quote, although some parts of it may be a bit obscure, but I want to give you the full taste of it. For context, this is a passage in the text in which a disciple asks the Buddha why, if all of our experience is inside the mind, do we perceive a world with its mountains and rivers? The Buddha then explains in detail how it is that the mind, which in its original state is free of delusion, comes to believe in the world of delusion that is its own making. Nothing need be added to true enlightenment, but once an understanding is added nevertheless, that understanding must understand something. So here we have the absolutely first delusion, the first moment when the mind that is originally pure and understands everything starts to become trapped. It's this first understanding that we are constantly adding to reality, where there's really nothing to understand. Once the category of something understood is mistakenly established in the mind, the category that which understands is mistakenly established as well. Subject and object, remember? At first, there is neither sameness nor differentiation, but then that which is differentiated is clearly distinguished. That which differs from what is differentiated is distinguished as being uniform. Because the category of what is differentiated and the category of what is uniform have been established, the category of what is neither uniform nor differentiated is further established. The turmoil of this mutual complementarity gives rise to mental strain, and as the mental strain is prolonged, grasping at objects of mind begins. Mental strain and grasping at objects together create a turbidity of mind, out of which the afflictions are generated. Motion becomes the world of perceived objects, and stillness is distinguished as space. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. I think that to really see what this quote is talking about, one would need to have a really, really still mind. But let's try to pan out some of the implications of this view. According to this text, the mind in its original state is already whole and complete. It already understands. Yet we are somehow adding an additional layer of understanding, and that sets into motion a kind of chain reaction through which we perceive the world we inhabit. This is phrased in past tense for language purposes, but it's actually something that is happening every instant of our lives. And that first movement immediately leads to the false distinction between what understands and that which is understood, subject and object. So according to this, if we could somehow trace our way back to this very first mind movement and stop adding this extra layer to consciousness. In other words, if we could stop projecting a subject and an object onto our experience, then we could return to the mind of original purity. But wait a moment, what does that even mean? How can there be no subject and object? It's impossible to imagine. And that's precisely the point. It's impossible because as long as we are thinking with our everyday consciousness, we are completely within the subject-object realm. This is pointing towards something that is far beyond our ordinary way of being in the world, and at the same time, something that is already here in our minds, happening right now. It's an extremely radical notion, paradoxical, and yet described with clinical precision. If I haven't yet convinced you that this text is a masterpiece of psychological, philosophical, and spiritual literature, then I don't know what else to say. But let's press on a bit further. Yes, it's inconceivable, but still, what would it mean to have no notion of subject and object? How would this radical approach to reality even work? Well, my guess, and this is really just a guess because I haven't had that kind of experience. My guess is that this would be like experience liberated from the self and thingness that we are constantly projecting onto it. Like a river in which things are seen as happening just as they are, without an agent being involved. Only water flowing freely through its innumerable causes and conditions, its numberless connections. You, me, and everything around us, just a kind of cosmic dance of phenomena interacting with each other without the need for getting or winning or losing. Just a kind of infinite peace that envelops and contains the entire cosmos. This brings us to the topic of emptiness. Another way that this fundamental confusion about the world is explained by the Yogacara school is by saying that the mind is deluded because it fails to realize the emptiness of self and the emptiness of objects. In matrix parlance, maybe we could say that someone is still plugged in because they have failed to realize that all the things, including their own identity, are nothing more than a computer program. I mean, think about it. If you were really inside the matrix, then you would believe all sorts of stuff about yourself and the world. But in reality, they would all be just pieces of code. They wouldn't have any fundamental reality. Your engineering degree and your spouse and your house. If you did the exercise at the beginning of the video, going through your week mentally, then that's what non emptiness feels like, basically. Our lives right now is how it feels to feel that everything is really going on as we think it is. But emptiness is not a void, a complete absence of everything. It's not nothingness. That would be nihilism. I think it's better to think about it in terms of the matrix. I think here Neo can fully see the emptiness of the matrix. He fully realizes it's not what he thought it was. Yet his experience of it is still happening. It's not that he's not experiencing anything. It's just that he's realized that reality is not as he thought it was. It's like correcting a deeply held misunderstanding about himself and the whole world. I think this is a better analogy for emptiness. It's not that stuff is not going on. It's just that we misinterpret and mistakenly label it as something that it's not. And if we are to believe the Matrix, to see things for what they are is liberating and even empowering. We just said that there's emptiness of self and the emptiness of phenomena. So let's go through the emptiness of self first with a bit more detail. I'm going to list some of the arguments that are used when explaining the emptiness of self, but I just want to emphasize that this was never meant as a theory or an abstract philosophy. It's something that, according to Buddhism, we can come to understand in our own experience. The arguments are merely there to point us in the right direction. So, what do we mean when we say myself? Well, the truth is, we mean a whole bunch of things. Basically, a kind of precognitive sense that includes our bodies and our minds in some kind of way. The Buddha divided this mind body amalgamation into 5 distinct categories of experience. Roughly, these are the physical body, the part of us that likes and dislikes stuff, the part of us that labels stuff, the part of us that receives sensory inputs, and the part of us that wills things along with other mental processes. These are the five aggregates, everything we experience as our bodies and minds conveniently categorized. So let's start with the body. Originally, we assumed that the body is somehow intimately tied to our personal identities. If something happens to it, we suffer. We take care of it, make it look pretty, and try to keep it comfortable. This is all at an instinctive level. It's a pre-conscious choice. However, an interesting question to ask is, what does it mean that something is myself, what I am? What would it mean for the body to be that which I am, or for it to truly belong to me? Well, according to the Buddha, for something to truly be me or mine, we would need to have control over it, right? How can it be me if I'm not in control of it? And we can say that we kind of are in control of the body, but only to a very small extent. Yes, I can choose to move my body however I want, except when doing yoga, I really can't do that. But in many other ways, my body is just doing its own thing, completely outside of my control. I can't will it to not get old or not to get sick. I can't control whether an accident will happen to it or whether it will suddenly malfunction. I can't even control whether it will get too hot or too cold or hungry. In fact, in many ways, it's me who's chasing behind what the body needs rather than the other way around. And even the best, most healthy, most perfect body will eventually grow old and stop existing. Well, at least until Elon Musk invents the Tesla body and I can download my consciousness to it. But seriously, in light of this reflection, can I really say that the body is me or it belongs to me? That's for you to think about. Now, just to restate, that doesn't mean that we don't experience the body or thoughts and feelings, but rather they can be interpreted differently. To make a gross analogy, thinking that we have a self would be like believing in the Matrix, and realizing that it's empty would be like seeing the ones and zeros. It's still going on, but we don't give it a meaning it never had. Well, at least that's the Buddhist idea. So, just as a thought experiment, if we truly saw that the body is not myself, what would that be like? What would a balanced view of the body be under this point of view? Well, I think that we would still take care of it because it's a useful thing. It's useful to have a body. But if something went wrong with it, or if it's not totally comfortable, or even if we get a really bad disease, because we're not identified with it anymore, we can just accept it as a natural thing and let it run its course. We don't fret about it anymore because we're not wanting the body to be something it's not, and our sense of self is not tied up with it. Whether this makes sense and whether it would be a good thing is up to you to reflect on and decide. Now, just like with the body, the Buddha said that all things that make up the mind, the remaining four aggregates, are also not me or mine. I'm not going to go through each of them because the argument is very similar. So, although this is profoundly unintuitive because we are so used to thinking in terms of myself, when we do an earnest investigation, we just can't find anything that is the solid nucleus of this assumption. The self is nowhere to be found. It's more something that the mind is constantly doing, than something that exists in and of itself. So, this, very roughly, is one way of approaching the idea of the emptiness of the self. Now, let's unpack the second type of emptiness. I think that the difference between understanding this type of emptiness is aptly illustrated in this scene.
How did I beat you? You're too fast. Do you believe that my being stronger or faster has anything to do with my muscles in this place? You think that's air you're breathing now?
Stop trying to hit me and hit me! I know what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to free your mind, Neo. But I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
The point here is not that understanding emptiness will turn you into a really awesome karate fighter, although you never really know, but rather that there's a fundamental difference between seeing what you experience as real and as not quite real. Now, again, that doesn't mean we don't experience things. Just like Neo, whether he knows he's in a program or not, he will still experience the fight with his senses. But rather, that we can interpret things from a totally different standpoint. We're not so attached to them because we see them for what they truly are. So, what do we mean when we say something is empty? Once again, I'm going to give you some of the arguments that the tradition uses, but don't mistake the intellectual understanding of emptiness with the real goal of it, to know it in ourselves experientially. One common way in which emptiness of objects is explained by the tradition is by noting that everything is interconnected. Usually, when the mind grasps an object, say an apple, we kind of abstract it into an individual thing with clearly defined boundaries, distinct to everything else. This is an apple. It has appleness. This is not an apple. But when we start looking closely, we realize that this apple, for its very existence, depended upon a tree. So its essence, whatever it really is, cannot be truly separated from the tree that it gave birth to. And that tree is dependent upon water and sunlight and having been planted and the earth and oxygen. I think you get where this is going. When we try to find a solid distinction between one thing and another, we find that we can't really find it. There's nothing in the world that exists on its own. Everything is sustained by everything else. When we fully realize this, we see that apple was nothing more than a conventional designation, a word useful to communicate with other people, but not a marker of something that exists in some ultimate way. This idea is expressed in what is for me one of the most beautiful metaphors in the Buddhist canon, Indra's net. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, it is said that the deity Indra has a net that extends infinitely in all directions. In each intersection of this net, there's a beautiful polished jewel. But if we look closely at any of the jewels, we then realize that all of the other innumerable jewels are reflected in it. And that jewel is in turn reflected by all the other jewels as well. Thus, when we look at the world, every phenomenon implicates all other phenomena, and it is implicated by them as well. Another way of thinking about emptiness that I find personally fascinating is to think about the following. Is this an apple? No. Is this an apple? No. However, in the course of a few weeks, this went from this to that. So a non-apple became an apple, and then it went back into being a non-apple. But if it changed so over a few weeks, that means it should have been changing every day, right? But if it was changing every day, then when we look closely, we must admit that it was already changing every hour, and then every minute, every second, every single moment. So despite what our ordinary perception tells us, things never really stand still. They are always in the process of becoming that which they are not. So, okay, there's no apples, there's no tables, there's no other people, at least not in the way we usually think of them. So what's the big deal? Well, according to Buddhism, that's our matrix. The fact that our minds are constantly telling us that there's really solid stuff around us that we can grasp onto. When we think there's really things out there, then we want some and we avoid others. Relationships, degrees, houses, cars, etc. Think about it. This is exactly how marketing works. How do you convince someone to buy something they don't need? You turn it into a thing. According to advertisement, Coca-Cola equals happiness. Is there really a Coke out there that will actually give you true happiness? Probably not. That Coke is a fiction. But some part of us believes in that fiction, and now we want a Coke and a car and the new iPhone. This is at a gross level, but that's the power of this kind of fiction. For it, we are willing to spend our lives working stressful jobs and fretting about it. I guess you could say that thinking in the thingness of things is the subtle, mind level marketing that convinces us of a whole lot of things that are not really there in the way we ordinarily think. So, what would it be like to live as if we knew everything is not truly a solid thing? Well, I think that we wouldn't be attached to stuff, right? There's no stuff to be attached to in the first place. We would try to have the things we need to survive. They're useful. But we wouldn't be constantly seeking for more things. And this includes non material stuff like fame or status. So, this is the power of seeing emptiness. Whether that's a desirable thing, you can think about it for yourself. But just to be totally clear, it's technically impossible for us with our conditioned mind to fully imagine what it would be like to see emptiness. Although, if we take the text's word for it, we can at least imagine that it's kind of the ultimate chill. So, okay, everything's empty, we don't really exist, and the world we think we live in is just a kind of simulation. But here's the $1,000,000 question. If this is all true according to Buddhism, why doesn't it seem that way? Why does everything seem so solid, and why do we take ourselves so seriously? Why is it so hard to let go of our self absorption and stop being so entangled with the world? I think Neo here experiences the same question.
Free your mind.
Whoa, no problem. Free my mind. Free my mind. No problem, right?
Even when he actually knows that it's a simulation, the habit of thinking it's real is just too strong to put down. According to Buddhists, this has to do with karma. Remember karma? Those seeds that lead us to interpret the world in certain ways, leading us to act in certain ways, leading to more seeds being planted. In other words, habits. This way of seeing the world is so hard to put down because we are very, very habituated to doing it. And we reinforce our habit through everything we do during everyday life. It's like an addiction. We're addicted to thinking we exist and the world is a solid place. However, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. This is the big difference between Buddhism and the Matrix. In Buddhism, there's no machines. Our collective delusion is not caused by an external agent, but by our own moment to moment choices. We, as a matter of fact, have created our own matrix, and we are choosing moment after moment to continue to inhabit it. This idea is actually touched upon in the second Matrix movie when Neo has a conversation with the architect, the creator of the Matrix.
Choice. The problem is choice.
The first matrix I designed was quite naturally perfect. It was a work of art, flawless, sublime, a triumph equaled only by its monumental failure. The inevitability of its doom is apparent to me now as a consequence of the imperfection inherent in every human being. As I was saying, she stumbled upon a solution whereby nearly 99% of all test subjects accepted the program as long as they were given a choice, even if they were only aware of the choice at a near unconscious level. While this answer functioned, it was obviously fundamentally flawed, thus creating the otherwise contradictory systemic anomaly. that if left unchecked might threaten the system itself.
So even for the matrix to work, people need to actually choose to be there at a nearly unconscious level. For me, this is a profoundly optimistic view of human nature. We in ourselves, in every moment, have everything we need to become free if we only choose to do so. If we only chose to stop going along with our delusions. And at the same time, this can also be very scary because ultimately, there's nobody to blame. We need to take full responsibility for our lives. Everything that happens to us is because of a choice we are making or made in the past. And very importantly, how we interpret what happens to us now is also our choice. Whatever circumstances we are in, we always have the freedom to decide how we are going to respond. In other words, from the Buddhist point of view, we are ultimately free and also ultimately responsible.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Oh, wrong movie. Yeah, freedom and responsibility. You can't have one without the other. This actually echoes the ideas of existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, whose famous maxim, existence precedes essence, means that human beings are not predetermined in any way. Rather, they are free to make themselves according to what they choose. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Or as he said, if, however, it is true that existence is prior to essence, man is responsible for what he is. Thus, the first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders. But is this a cruel idea? Is this like blaming the victim? After all, the world is full of cases where innocent people suffer horrible disgraces and bad people live happily. Well, first of all, I would argue that the second part is not really true if we look closely. But most importantly, the idea of this type of freedom is not that we are always going to be in control of our circumstances. Yes, life may always throw nasty things at us. This is the human condition and has always been so. But the point of this view, I think, is that no matter what happens to us, we can always have the option of not turning ourselves into a victim, but responding with dignity, kindness, and patience. And that these choices do matter, and they are, in the end, what determines who we become, who we have chosen to become. This was emphatically expressed by Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist. During World War II, his parents and his wife were killed by the Nazis, and then he was sent to a concentration camp, where he was submitted to the most horrible kinds of abuse and privation. You would think this would be enough to make someone bitter and despise life and humanity. Yet, this is what he had to say after his experience. We who live in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. So just for argument's sake, suppose you agree with this. You think all of this is a great idea, and you start thinking that being totally free and taking responsibility for your life doesn't sound all that bad. So now what? We still have all these strong habits of mind pulling us around. And as anybody who has seriously tried to change knows, it's just not that easy, even when we have the best intentions. It's like trying to stop a huge ship that's been accelerating at top speed for hundreds of miles. The inertia of past habits can be very powerful. Well, that's when the practical aspect of the Buddha's teaching comes in. Basically, the Buddha and Buddhists for many millennia have broken down the steps we can take to gradually approach this ideal of total freedom into things we can do in our daily lives. Because that's the only place anything can happen, daily life. In fact, the Buddha was quite specific. He said there's 8 things we can do that will take us along the path towards total freedom. They are called the Eightfold Noble Path, and it's usually divided into morality, concentration, and wisdom. Let's start with morality or ethical conduct. Now, this can be a tricky subject in modern society, and words like morality or virtue can spark discomfort or even outright rejection in some people. Basically, nobody wants to feel like they're being told what to do or like they're being judged according to an external, arbitrary standard of what is right and wrong. Incidentally, this is a topic that is also taken up by Sartre, according to whom the fact that man is alone in the world and that he can make himself means that he is free to decide the values he lives by without reference to some higher principle. And yes, it's true that in Buddhism there isn't a higher law in the sense of a series of rules that have been laid down by a figure of authority. What there is in Buddhism is an understanding of causality. Certain actions have certain effects, and there are just some actions that will universally be experienced as suffering by ourselves and others, such as killing, cheating, or stealing. So holding on to an ethical code of conduct is ultimately about freedom. This can be counterintuitive because usually we think about freedom as being able to do what we want with no limitations from authority. However, the point here is that if we don't account for the consequences of what we do, then our freedom is short sighted. In the short term, we can do whatever we want, sure, but if we are harming ourselves and others, then sooner or later we're going to have to deal with all the forces we have set into motion. So actually, restraint and discernment are in the long term much more freeing because they create the conditions for better choices in the future. And I think that at a really basic level of experience, we kind of already know this. We all have felt the peace and natural joy that comes from being generous or kind. And we've all also experienced the kind of regret and discomfort that comes from having harmed another person or doing something that we're not really proud of. As we go through life, we can dull these feelings, but it's hard to deny that they are a basic part of what makes us human. At the most basic level, the Buddha said that morality consists of the 5 precepts: to refrain from intentionally killing other living beings, stealing, abusing our sexuality, telling lies, and becoming intoxicated. And a very, very important point is that in Buddhism, there is no concept of shame. Because human nature is assumed to be fundamentally good rather than fundamentally flawed, it is never a good strategy to hate or punish ourselves when we don't live up to our best intentions. There's nobody judging us. We just have to take responsibility for ourselves and gradually learn to make better choices. I think that the whole point of ethical behavior and how it's a very practical psychological tool was aptly summarized by the Buddha in the following discourse. Skillful virtues have freedom from remorse as their purpose, Ananda, and freedom from remorse as their reward. Freedom from remorse has joy as its purpose. Joy has rapture as its purpose. Rapture has serenity as its purpose. Serenity has pleasure as its purpose. Pleasure has concentration as its purpose, and concentration has knowledge and vision of things as they actually are as its purpose. So it is through ethical behavior that we can begin to attain a degree of peace of mind that will allow us to go deeper into our experience. This takes us to samadhi, the second factor of the path. In general terms, samadhi can roughly be said to be when the mind is calm and focused, and it's associated with a feeling of profound well being. It is also used to refer to states of deep concentration during meditation. I like to think of meditation as Buddhism's secret weapon, although it's definitely not an exclusively Buddhist practice. Hindus and Christians and the classical traditions of philosophy have all historically practiced meditation. From a philosophical perspective, if we are trying to find out the truth of the mind, the universe, and everything else, we are always relying on our minds to do so. Even with the most sophisticated scientific instruments and theories, we still need our minds to understand, make sense, and interpret them. So, in a way, meditation is to the mind what a scientific instrument is to the world, a special technology that allows for us to see things that ordinarily would be inaccessible. The simple reason for this is that the mind in its ordinary state is under a constant state of agitation. It is constantly being pulled hither and thither by its likes, projections, emotions, and perceptions. It's in a constantly habitual mode of reaction to the world, and it rarely gets a break to slow down and reflect on what it's really doing. And even when we try to understand ourselves, when we do a bit of introspection, we're still relying on the very same mind. So, unless we can see deeper into the way it's operating at a more subtle level, we remain trapped in its habitual patterns of action and reaction. That is to say, karma. It's very common for people to start meditating and think that they're getting worse because the first time they try to deliberately sit down and pay attention, they are overwhelmed by a deluge of thoughts, memories, and stories. But it's not that it's getting worse, it's that maybe for the first time ever, we are taking a look at what our minds are really like. It's like walking into a room that we haven't cleaned for decades. Except that room is the thing that we depend on for basically everything in life. From the Yogacara perspective, that deluge of thoughts and memories is actually all the seeds that we have been planting throughout our days, weeks, and months, coming up into consciousness. If you pay attention, you'll see that you're not really in control of all these thoughts. They just sort of appear there and they have their own direction that they are pulling us in. So in reality, most of our life is spent in a kind of autopilot, directed by our habits, by the choices we have made in the past. Thoughts and emotions are the past coming into the present. And unless we learn to pay attention to them, we'll just get swept along with very little agency over our choices and our life. So, in terms of the matrix, we could maybe say that meditation is like the practice through which we learn to do this. Slowly start to see the building blocks of our life. And the more we see, the more we can choose whether to go with our impulses and thoughts or to just let them pass. Be patient with them and not go with something that may not be skillful, that may create a lot of trouble for us later on. The idea is to become a skillful gardener for our minds, to choose which seeds we want to plant with the awareness that whatever we plant now, we will reap later. And that can only be done if we learn how to pay close attention. And this takes us to the last of the three factors of the path, wisdom or prajna. By acting in skillful ways and calming down the mind through disciplined practice, we can start to pay attention and see how our mind is working and constructing reality. All the stuff we talked about earlier in the video, which then becomes not some abstract theory, but something we can experience in our everyday lives. Now, so far in the video, we have been speaking about conditioned reality or samsara, or the sort of world we inhabit when we project our mind's delusions onto our experience, and which keeps us trapped in a cyclical pattern of confusion through the force of habit or karma. And we also talked about ultimate reality or nirvana, the experience that it's possible to have once the mind is able to see through its projections. And it would seem like they are two things far apart from each other, right? That's our conditioned thinking. If it's not this, then it's that. If I'm not enlightened, therefore I'm ignorant. But maybe someday, far away into the future, if I work really hard, then I might attain nirvana or liberation. And this picture makes sense from the conditioned point of view. But remember what we said earlier? That when talking about ultimate reality, all conditional concepts fail to really capture it. Well, this is no exception, and I will finish the video with the idea of the three natures in Yogacara, which I find incredibly amazing and illuminating for this point. In Yogacara, it is said that reality, that is, our experience, can be divided into three different natures: the imagined, the conditioned, and the real. The imagined nature is the world we perceive when we are projecting things out there. The conditioned nature refers to experience as seen from its causal aspect, how everything arises from causes and in turn conditions new phenomena. And the real is the conditioned nature freed from the imagined. That is, when reality is seen from its causal aspect, but without projecting any additional interpretations onto it. Now, in terms of the matrix, I think we could say that life inside of the simulation is like the imagined nature. We believe in it, but it's not really happening. It's just a projection. The conditioned nature would be like the programs, the way all of the different bits of software are interacting to create this reality. And the real nature is when Neo is able to see through the programming and into what is actually going on. Now, here's where it gets interesting. One of my favorite Yogacara texts is the verses on the three natures attributed to the Buddhist thinker Vasubandhu. In it, he describes the three natures and he says that they are really not separate from one another. The imagined, the other dependent, and the real. These are the three natures which should be deeply understood. Since the former has the nature of a false duality, and the latter is the non-existence of that nature, the imaginary and the real are said not to be different in characteristic. That is, the imaginary and the real exist independent of each other. In the ultimate analysis, they are not really separate, just like Neo seeing through the matrix depends on there being a matrix in the first place. And similarly, since the former is deceptive in the way it appears, and the latter has the nature of its not being that way, the dependent and the real are said not to be different in characteristic. So again, the real can only exist in relation to the dependent, just like Neo can only see the software he exists in because there is a software to be seen in the first place. So what all of this means is that according to Yogacara, nirvana is in fact not something far away, far removed from our everyday experience, but actually it is in a way contained in our everyday experience. Everything we say, think, or do has in itself the potential for adding wood to the fire of delusion or for being a catalyst for wisdom. This paradoxical notion was expressed by the great Chinese Chan master Huineng, who said, "The Buddha Dharma is here in the world. Enlightenment is not apart from the world. To search for awakening apart from the world is like looking for a hare with horns. We don't need to go find a hermit in some faraway cave to have a shot at real wisdom. We only need to learn to pay attention to our lives right now. Everything we experience has the seed of wisdom within it. and the ordinary is not really separate from the extraordinary. I would like to end this video with a Chinese verse that speaks to this and which I find very inspiring. The sea of suffering has no end. Just turn your head around and there's the other side. So in conclusion, in the Yogacara system, we are trapped in the matrix, but we all have the potential for this. You, me, everybody. We are all, right now, right as we are, the chosen one.
He is the one.
If you enjoyed this video, you can also check out some of the other talks that we have hosted at DRBU about similar topics. We have another one about the Matrix and one about loneliness as well. And if you want to attend one of these talks live, I mean online, but live, click the link in the description.